For God's sake, this man cannot remain in power. I'm not walking anything back. I was expressing the more outrage I felt toward the way Putin is dealing and the actions of this man. Just brutality. It doesn't mean we have a fundamental policy to do anything to take Putin down in any way.
Hi everyone, and welcome to another edition of Backstory. I'm Dana Lewis. There appears to be some progress this week in talks to stop the fighting in Ukraine after Russia's month-long brutal war. The two sides met in Istanbul. Ukraine committed to becoming a neutral, non-nuclear state, giving up its ambition to ever join NATO. And in return, it would get security guarantees from possibly the US, Germany, France, and others that if it's attacked, again it would be defended. What about the land taken so far by Russia, the Donbass, the Crimea, and in between? No deal, and neither side is giving ground. Russia will, however, drastically reduce its military activity near Kiev and Chernihiv as peace talks in Ukraine progress, according to Moscow's deputy defense minister. But a lot of people don't believe that pledge. So much to discuss about Russia's real intentions, danger still looming, Putin's rule and why he won't give up power. We have former U.S. military attaché to Moscow, retired Brigadier General Kevin Ryan, who is now a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School Belfer Center. But first, Olga Oliker. Olga Oliker is with the International Crisis Group, and she is the Crisis Group's Program Director for Europe and Central Asia. Hi again, Olga.
Hi, how are you?
Can you imagine that when we spoke last, there were Russian troops on the Ukrainian border? A lot of speculation, would they or wouldn't they? I certainly thought they would. But, I don't want to brag that I had some window that others didn't, because I don't think I ever imagined that they would go this far, this brutally, into cities like, Mariupol and others. And the question now is, how does this end?
Yeah, so for my part, I thought it was very plausible that they would. And I expected it to be worse earlier. I expected more of what we're seeing now a month ago. And I'm not sure if that's something I should be happy about or sad about, either the predicting or just how it's gone instead.
You mean you felt that they would be more efficient as a battle group entering Ukraine because they've had a lot of difficulties?
Yeah, no. So look, my prediction was that the Ukrainians would fight harder than the Russians expected them to, but I did not predict that the Russians would not fight as well as we predicted them to. Right. And it's a combination of these two things that has made this a completely different war than the one we expected. And the one we expected was one where the Ukrainians fought valiantly, but lost quickly in the end. And that is not the war we're seeing. We're seeing something that could drag out as long as both sides can send weapons and people. Now, they can send weapons probably indefinitely, as long as the Russians can keep making them and the Ukrainians can keep importing them. I don't know how long either side can keep sending people. The Russians are reinforcing. In principle, they have more capacity to do that than does Ukraine, which is limited to its population and, some volunteers that are coming from around the world. But I don't know that those people are particularly useful in a fight. But when we see what Russia is actually doing, when it's moving troops in from Armenia, when it's moving in forces from Abkhazia, you start thinking that maybe they don't have that many people, that maybe there is a greater gap than you thought. So that might be one of the limits on the length of this operation. But look, the good way for this to end is with the Russian forces withdrawing from Ukraine and a sustainable peace. There are all sorts of things in between. And then there's also horrific escalation that are also all possible.
That's why you're writing in some of your pieces recently that I've read, you're saying it's a very dangerous moment.
It's an incredibly dangerous moment. This is a war between Russia, which has the most nuclear weapons of any country in the world, And Ukraine, which has no nuclear weapons, no chemical weapons, no biological weapons, but does have the backing of the United States and its NATO allies. And the United States is the country with the second largest nuclear arsenal. And France and Great Britain, also members of NATO, also have substantial nuclear arsenals. So your risk, if you have direct conflict between Russia and NATO, if this war one way or another grows into that, the risk of nuclear escalation, the risk of global thermonuclear war, this risk, this threat that kept us awake when we were children and that many people thought had largely gone away, becomes a very, very real risk. And I'm not saying that it's going to happen. I am saying that this is something that is so horrible that even an infinitesimal increase in its probability is something that should make you think twice.
Is the fact that Ukraine has fought better than others maybe predicted, and they've made it much more difficult for the Russians to seize cities? I mean, I think they'll get Mariupol in the end. It'll be a dust bowl at that point, but not much left of the city. It's horrendous. But
it does go with a port. They've been avoiding the port facilities.
Does this set the stage for a different kind of negotiation with Putin, because Ukraine actually has some leverage now?
Right. Look, it's clear, if insofar as anything is clear, that the Russians did not expect the Ukrainians to fight at all, that they expected to be welcomed with bread and salt, the Eastern European version of candy and flowers. They expected to have the Ukrainians be perfectly comfortable getting Russian-backed governments put in place. And, this was all this talk of so-called denazification, which, is an effort. It's this effort to say that the last good war, perhaps the only good war, was World War II. So if you want to justify your war, call your adversary a Nazi, and then you can do that. But that's been very much the Russian narrative. It's also the Ukrainian narrative. So their idea behind it, though, was that they were going to force the Zelensky government from power and replace it. It was a regime change plan. It is clear that's not happening. They are negotiating with the Zelensky government. They seem to understand they're stuck with it. So we've seen that shift, and that is absolutely a product of the Ukrainians fighting. Now, in terms of what other Russian expectations are going to back away from, I think it depends on how long the Ukrainians keep fighting and how much pain they can inflict on Russia. I mean, this is very much, and how much pain the Russians decide they're willing to take. The problem, of course, is that there is the other pain of walking away without a victory, of walking away having been defeated by Ukraine. And that may not be an acceptable loss for Moscow, which could keep things going perhaps indefinitely, right?
Moscow or Putin, because if Putin wants to remain in power, I mean, the cornerstone of that has been that he always appears to be the tough guy and that he wins. And for him to accept anything less than some kind of victory that he can advertise to the Russian people and his inner circle, which is largely yes men now, he needs some kind of victory, which that brings us to this whole idea of, keeping eastern part of Ukraine up to the Dnieper, maybe splitting the country in two and making it look a little bit like North and South Korea.
Look, Moscow doesn't control that much of Ukraine, so I don't think that's actually on the agenda. Moscow doesn't even control all of what it claimed, what it recognized as independent in Donetsk and Luhansk, right? Because the two breakaways claimed 3 times as much territory as they actually controlled. And they've made some progress, particularly in Luhansk. The Russians and the separatist fighters continue to fight with them, but they don't control all that much of Donetsk, even with all of this fighting for the past month. Mm-hmm. So, the argument that they can split the country, well, first of all, they split the country 8 years ago. The country's been split, and the Russians, by recognizing it, and demanding this recognition from Ukraine, that's been one of their war aims all along. How feasible it is and what it actually looks like, I don't know. Again, it depends on what the situation looks like on the ground. What it means for Russian domestically, look, I would say that they have a lot of leeway. They've got a very controlled information environment and a population that they could spin up to be pro-war on a dime. I don't understand, or on a ruble coin. I imagine they can do the same thing to sell the peace, and they would not be the first country to declare victory and retreat. There are ways to do this. I don't know, kind of this whole question of what can the Putin government survive, what can't it survive? It's a pretty survivable government, and there isn't anything else waiting in the wings to take its place. So my bet is on it surviving, at least for a while. And I think that's something that Western policymakers, Ukrainian policymakers need to come to terms with, that they may not want to. Just as Vladimir Putin did not want to deal with Vladimir Zelensky and Joe Biden and Emmanuel Macron, all of them have to deal with Vladimir Putin and are going to have to keep dealing with Vladimir Putin probably for some time to come.
Is that why you're seeing, I don't want to call it a walk back, because I don't think Joe Biden actually walked back his comments. He said, he called Putin a butcher, and he said, for God's sake, this man cannot remain in power. And then on the weekend, on Sunday, he was asked, are you calling for a regime change? And he shouted back as he was getting in a motorcade, no.
No, I just don't.
I don't think he really walked back regime change, because he never called for regime change, in fairness to Biden.
Well, he called, it certainly sounded like an off-the-cuff sort of remark. And I do think it was a very emotional remark. I don't think it's a particularly helpful remark. The problem is that... But
it's a remark that a lot of people would make. Russians I know who have recently just left the country are all sitting around saying, I wish this guy would go. I wish he would just go.
But he's been there since 1999, and odds are that he's going to stay there a bit longer. And
constitutionally till 2036 potentially.
So, and constitutions can be changed as we've learned. So look, as Putin has learned, regime change isn't that easy, and that's with an army. The United States has also found that getting rid of a regime is easier than putting a new one in place.
That's for sure.
The history of revolution in Russia is not one that should make us all very eager to see a new revolution in Russia. So, kind of saying this man must go, this man cannot remain in power as sort of wishful thinking. Okay. But what's your alternative, and how do you plan to get there? And how do you do that with a country that has the world's largest nuclear arsenal?
Okay, so if I can, sorry, and I don't mean to keep cutting you off, but you're kind of leading me into other discussion, and that is, in a way, then, if you can't get rid of him and you can't defeat him, and he cannot defeat Ukraine, then isn't Zelensky and the West and people who support him then getting into, for lack of a better term, a game, but I don't want to trivialize it, aren't they getting into a strategic game of playing for time here? And that is, get the fighting stopped, try to come to some kind of terms that will lead to the maximum withdrawal, and then wait Putin out, just wait him out.
Yeah, well, I think some people have been trying to wait Putin out for a while. The question is, look, a good peace, a sustainable peace, is one where the Russians can sell some level of victory at home, where the Ukrainians have sustainable security, which honestly, I've got to say, if the Russians have to leave Ukraine, and they should have to leave Ukraine, I'm not sure they're going to be emboldened to more military adventurism, right? It's not like this has gone well and it makes you want to go invade somebody else or Ukraine again. And given that this army is the product of all of the lessons learned of 2008, when they were unhappy with their performance in Georgia, and it seems to be worse than the Russian army of 2008, I'm not sure they can rebuild real fast, right? That in 2 years, they're going to have the army they dreamed of. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say they will not. So what you want is a settlement that constrains Russia. I might argue that this war going forward, any settlement is going to constrain Russia to some extent. But that's what you want. And then
so then is it that brings you to a neutral country, a promise of no NATO membership, and some kind of demilitarization? Does that get Russia to where you want them to be?
Demilitarization.
Ukraine to where Russia wants Ukraine to be.
Russia wants Ukraine to be Poland in 1972. Russia has probably at this point realized that is not what Ukraine is ever going to be, and also that Russia is not the Soviet Union of 1972. So I think if I were Ukraine, I would no longer want to join NATO. Honestly, there's an argument to be made that a NATO country would not have been able to respond as quickly and as effectively to a full-scale attack. I don't know if that's 100% true, but it's it's an interesting question for speculation of bureaucratic systems and structures, popular mobilization, et cetera, et cetera. I don't know. It's an interesting question. No NATO membership. The Ukrainians seem willing to walk away from NATO membership. Then I would say instead of talking about demilitarization, I would talk about force limits along borders and lines of contact. And I would talk about them on both sides in order to make the Ukrainians feel more secure. And the Russians can go home and call that demilitarization. But what I would be interested in is real limits on what kind of forces you can put how close to your border.
And there are a lot of models for that. For instance,
and there are a lot of models for that. And there's
peacekeeping force between Israel and Egypt, where they even go out and they measure how much gas is in a tank so it cannot get to the border on either side. And there are a lot of models for that, exactly, that bring security to both sides.
And this is the sort of thing I think you could discuss. I don't think we're there yet. I do think both the Russians and the Ukrainians think continued is going to make the other one back off more. The problem and I understand that, and I'm sympathetic, particularly to the Ukrainians on this. The challenge I see for all of the rest of us is that the longer this drags on, first, the more Ukrainians die, and also the more Russians die. But second, I think the risks of it escalating into involving NATO member states and thus potentially a broader war in Europe, and then a broader that terrifying next step of nuclear escalation becomes more and more plausible. And I'd like to back away from that if at all possible. And the only way I see to do that is a negotiated settlement sooner. But I also think that I completely understand that the negotiated settlement needs to be something that Kyiv can live with.
Could Kyiv live with, to wrap this up, could Kyiv live with annexation of Donetsk? Could Kyiv live with having to recognize the annexation of Crimea? And could Kyiv live with a land bridge to the Crimea?
So interesting. I don't know the answers to these questions. Look, they've been living with the annexation of Crimea de facto for 8 years. There's no real plan for how they would reintegrate Crimea. Can they live with losing even more of Donbass than they had before, which means giving up a population that has been living under Ukrainian rule for all of this time, right? To say nothing of the population they've essentially been fighting a war for the last 8 years. I think that's a tough thing to give up. And if they feel that they are in a stronger position militarily, I don't see why they would give it up. But we will see. I mean, what Zelensky has said is that he is willing to talk about Donbass. And one thing we could see is a sort of return to a Minsk-like structure where there isn't a solution, but there are endless conversations. And, if there's less shooting, that's actually better than what we had for the last 8 years.
I think we'll leave it there, Olga. Thank you, Olga Oliker from the International Crisis Group. And I wish I had forced you into a corner and given me hard answers on how this ends, but I think nobody knows yet. And that tells you that, unfortunately, the fighting probably will not stop for a while, because until both sides are exhausted and see that they have to very quickly make compromises and move towards a settlement, if both sides think that they have some kind of momentum, whether it's the Russians in Mariupol or whether it's the Ukrainians around Kiev counterattacking and pushing, they'll be talking, but there may not be a real firm resolution to coming to an agreement. Would you agree with that?
I think that's exactly right.
Unfortunate, but that's where we are. Olga, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Retired Brigadier General Kevin Ryan from the U.S. Army is a senior fellow at Harvard Kennedy School, Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs, and he was actually based in Moscow at the embassies, at the U.S. Embassy as a military attaché, very early on when President Putin had first come to power. Is that right, Kevin?
Right, 2001 to 2003.
What would you say about this man who we saw, take over from President Yeltsin, express a desire at the time to, live peacefully with the West, and even at one point entertain the idea of becoming part of NATO, or at least that Russia would cooperate with NATO? We've seen quite an evolution in 22 years.
Yeah. Well, Putin today is certainly a lot more powerful person than he was back then as an acting president and then newly elected president. And he's gained power, he's gained confidence in the role. But I think across all the years, from beginning and even to now, Putin is more a reflection of what Russia is, or what the Russian ruling elite want Russia to be, than he is necessarily the leader of that movement.
I'm not so sure, because he seems to have become very isolated, and that inner circle and the ruling Russian elite, have really shrunk in terms of the class and size of people around him.
Right. And so this is an opinion, and it can be argued for sure, but I see him reflecting a lot of things. People, for example, recently have been pointing out a Russian mystic philosopher named Dugin. You probably have even heard of him. He's a guy who's a monarchist, he's a nationalist, he's a fascist, but he's also a guy who thinks of Russia in a special way as a place that's different than the East and the West. And they say, what Putin's doing is right out of Dugin's playbook, written in 1998. No, it's not, but it does reflect some of those things. And that's what I mean by Putin reflecting a movement in Russia that he is, I think, was put into place by the FSB. He's been kept there by the FSB. And if he were taken away today, or if he stepped down, which he won't, but if for some reason he were to be hit by a truck, as we used to say in the US, in the Midwest, who would step in for him? There are people there who are very much like him, who would be ready to step in, maybe worse, maybe better, but very much like him, I think. And that's why I mean when he was reflecting.
Well, that's depressing, sir. Thanks for sharing that. Because one would hope that there are some young, moderate, European-leaning, liberal-leaning people who might emerge, and if President Putin's hard shadow wasn't there, that maybe they would begin to move back towards Europe and back towards European norms.
I think you're right, and that there are those people, but I don't think they're able to step forward in this system. They are the inner circle is insulated from that, because, and this is different than when Yeltsin came on board, because the FSB is there and has very firm control. When Yeltsin came on board, it was in the wake of
the first things he did.
Yeah,
was to do away with the KGB. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, well, that you and I are on the same wavelength, and in fact, you could say that Yeltsin came on board because of a coup, right, in the summer of '91, by Yazov and some others, and the security services like the FSB. Mm-hmm. But it was in the infancy of this era, and I think the FSB was not really thinking along these lines, so they were unprepared for it. And when it came down, the FSB said, "Okay, we're going to go with Yeltsin and not with Gorbachev." But
and yet, if I can jump in again to interrupt you, and I don't mean to be rude, and yet Yeltsin, I mean, the first thing he did was remove the KGB. Then it was reading the FSB. Right. He understood that it was a state within a state, and the only way to have a democracy and to have political control from the Kremlin was to do away with the KGB and push them off. And yet, at the end, he appoints Vladimir Putin, first of all, to the head of the Security Council, and then appoints him to become his successor, knowing he came from those ranks. And when you come from the KGB, you're always the KGB.
So now it's my turn to say, why is that? And the reason, I believe, is that we were witnessing a soft revolution, if you will. I think the FSB came to Putin, or to Yeltsin and his family, and said, "You are in a corner. You know, you've been corrupt. Things are out of control in our country. It's lawless. We need some stability. And the only way that's going to happen is you're going to get bounced out of this job. And you can either go quietly and keep your money in your pocket, or we can arrange this to be messy, and you can go at a trial and the Russian people can hear and see what you did." And
it's an interesting theory, because Yeltsin was also on the verge of being impeached. And there were very big investigations into fraud by Tatiana Dachenko and foreign bank accounts, and Yeltsin was under a lot of pressure and physically failing at that point.
Let me give you a piece of anecdotal evidence. I run a group called the Elba Group, which are senior 3- and 4-star retirees from both the military and the intelligence services. So we have on there from the Russian side a former GRU chief, Kotelbelnikov. We have a former FSB chief. We have a former minister of interior, and so on. And we've been meeting with these people off and on since 2010. Now, last time was in October, so I don't know when our next meeting will be. But anyway, one of the things that they told me is the former FSB guy said, you know, he was talking about Trump. He said, "Trump is your Yeltsin." And I said, "What are you talking about?" He says, you know, Yeltsin came in and he turned everything upside down. He went against the intelligence services. He went against all the power centers, and he broke them all up. And he said, and then he made us a laughing stock on the international scene. We eventually dealt with Yeltsin. You're going to have to deal with Trump the same way we dealt with Yeltsin. That was his point. He was making a point about Trump. But to your point, he was admitting that Yeltsin was pushed out. He's not necessarily agreeing with me that it was because solely by the FSB, but he was saying Yeltsin was an aberration and he was pushed out.
Anyway, President Putin, whether he was pushed in by Yeltsin or the security services, he owns it, and he owns the war crimes that have been committed in Crimea. He owns the invasion. Clearly, he intimidated his inner circle. That meeting on the week before they launched the war, I mean, where everybody is filmed and looks like they dipped their hand in blood. He intimidated a member of his security service at that point as well. But look, I really want to get your read on what's happening in Ukraine. Where do you think that this is headed? Because some people would say that the Ukrainians are doing so well and they're turning back the Russians. But at the same time, I mean, there are many big question marks on the battlefield as to how this is going to go. Would you agree with that? And where are they for you?
Yeah, I agree. There are most of what's happened, I think we have in a consensus out there in the press right now. You know, Russia came in, there were high expectations. They've failed to meet those high expectations. There are lower ones now. And it looks like what Russia is going to do is try to get as much land in the east as it can, in the south along the Black Sea coast, and then to keep the West and the US, NATO, et cetera, at bay by bombing and firing missiles at Western Ukraine. So that's pretty much where we are today. And then the only question is how much time before we get to a point where the Russian side, which is in control of this really because of its military, the Russian side decides, okay, this is what we're going to accept as the land that we're going to take and the situation, and we will be willing to actually talk about a ceasefire and some sort of a long-term agreement. It may not be an official end of the war, but it's at least a stopping point.
Do you think, first of all, there is a danger to Ukrainian troops that are still fighting in the east of being encircled, but based on what you're seeing on the ground?
Yes, absolutely. This is the biggest danger to Ukraine, and that these troops, these units that are outnumbered and outgunned and have fought so courageously and well, that there could be a mistake. And if they are encircled, if they allow themselves to get encircled and destroyed, then Russia has nobody in their way because the West is not there, right? The West has declined to participate in this fight for obvious reasons. So that is the one wild card in this whole thing. Otherwise, it will go according to the laws of nature. You know, the Russian military, which is 3 times the size of the Ukrainian, will eventually overcome its tactical errors, and they'll accomplish their operational goals, which are whatever they have on the east side of the Dnieper River.
Do you think that you're looking at the breakup of Ukraine into 2 parts, a bit like North and South Korea?
Yeah.
Along the Dnieper River?
Yes. The Dnieper River would be a logical boundary. Maybe the Russians can't get there. I don't know. They've screwed it up so far. I think they would like to get to the Dnieper River. They could then hold some strategic ground. They would hold that energy plant down in Zaporizhia, which is one of the largest in the country, of Europe, certainly the country. And they, nuclear, sorry. And that's a defensible piece of terrain. And it's one that's the size that it will cost them a lot of troops and a lot of presence and money, but they can occupy that much territory. They couldn't possibly occupy all of Ukraine. And that's really one of the reasons there's a limit on what Putin can do. And these limits, these things like the manpower limit, the equipment limit, the competence limit, those things are limiting what Putin can actually achieve in Ukraine. He wanted more, but he'll take this, and it will be a sizable accomplishment. And people will argue over who had the victory: the courageous Ukrainians who prevented the entire, occupation of their country, or the Russians who took part of it.
How historically could the Ukrainians and Zelensky carry any kind of a ceasefire or peace agreement with Russia by giving up half the country? I mean, it seems to me that after all of this, after this bloodshed and loss, heroic fighting by the Ukrainians, that even if Zelensky wants to, I don't think people will follow him down that path where they would give up or surrender half the country. Do you?
No. And in this case, then the analogy with Korea is very appropriate, because what can happen here is that the Russians can say, well, we're halting our military operation. We're going to stop the fighting, and even paint themselves to be the peacemakers, because they know that the Ukrainians will not accept their demands, and Ukrainians know they can't, the political leadership knows they can't possibly accede to these, make these kinds of concessions. So the Russians will say, well, we have a line established. We're going to stop fighting unless you provoke us or unless you probe these lines. Russia will be big enough to hold that line. Ukraine will be too small to break through it. And we will have what we had in Korea, a war that's still technically going on, but the fighting is stopping for the most part. The one big advantage of this kind of a ending for Russia is that the US and NATO have said, we're not going in there because there's a war going on, and we don't want to get into a war with Russia. Well, if the war doesn't end, Russia forces the neutrality on Ukraine, whether Zelensky would agree to it or not. And they keep their land by brute force.
Putin has his precious Crimea,
Right.
And a land bridge to Crimea,
Right.
and the Sea of Azov, and partially seals Ukraine off from the Black Sea. I mean, strategically, he wins a lot.
He does. And so then the question becomes, what will the West do? Will they eventually lose interest and fold and drop the sanctions and buy the cheaper oil and gas from Russia, et cetera? Or will they hold the line? And because Putin has said these sanctions are an act of war, and on that I agree with him. These sanctions are very tough, and they could cause the fall of his regime, which is the one thing that he's trying to prevent throughout all of this. So it's interesting that everything we've talked about so far, all that could go either way, but the sanctions are not even on the table because when Putin negotiates with Ukraine, he's negotiating with Zelensky. Zelensky has no control over the sanctions. The sanctions are a Western construct, the U.S. construct, and we're not even talking about negotiations yet with the U.S. and West. So these sanctions are long living if the West keeps its spine.
They're long living also because, we end towards the beginning where you talked about the aspirations of the Russian elite and how they still see Russia as an empire, the threats to other NATO countries, which they have made openly now. They've even, talked about a land bridge across Latvia to Kaliningrad. Latvia or Estonia? I got my map upside down there.
No, Lithuania down there, but yeah, I know what you're talking about. The
Suwałki
Gap
near Poland across.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's a lot of movement that Russia could make within the Black Sea as well. So to lift sanctions because there's a ceasefire in Ukraine, when the very nature of the sanctions are punitive to try and stop Putin from funding an aggressive military, would be folly, would it not?
Yeah, it would. But but don't underestimate us in the West. We love folly. We love making mistakes too, and we could pull a disaster out of this victory. One of the things that President Biden has said in Poland was, how can this guy stay in power? And then they tried to walk it back and say, well, we're not about regime change and all. I think we should own that. I think we should say, because in Washington, that's all people talk about. Is how is Putin going to keel over? Somebody going to shoot him? Is people going to rise up and take him out? Is he going to be forced out of power? Of course, we want regime change. Of course, we do. We're not going to send troops in or agents with the Novichok and try to kill him. No, we're not doing that. But absolutely, American policy is that we would like Putin out. And the way you see that are the things that people say and these sanctions and calling him a war criminal.
I guess it was important for Biden to clarify. I don't believe he had to walk it back either, but I guess it was important for Biden to clarify.
Sure.
He was not calling for regime change because then Putin will use that to say that it's an existential threat to Russia. But clearly, even the Russians I know, and there are many of them who have left Russia in the last few weeks and wound up in places like Dubai and Istanbul and Cyprus, and they've taken their families and they're getting out and they're not going back and they've lost their businesses. And, Russia's, the clock has been turned back 20 and 30 years. They are saying, why doesn't Putin just go? So I think what Biden said was,
he's speaking from the heart,
probably on the minds of everybody he had talked to that day.
Yeah, you captured it. He's speaking from the heart, and we should just own it, I think.
Do you want to make a last prediction on how you think this ends? Does it go on for months? And how do you think?
I think, unfortunately, it can go on for a long time now that Russia has given up the hope of taking Kyiv. I believe they have. I think they're running out of personnel. There's lots of evidence for that, and conscripts are showing up in the Russian military in Ukraine, which is against Russian law. So I think it could go on for a while because they've pulled themselves back into a more manageable set of goals. And the violence can go up and down, regardless of whether it's a quote on escalation or not. So it could go on for a while. For the people in Ukraine, this is not the end of it yet. But we are seeing the end. it can't go on forever because Putin is out of contract soldiers. He's out of money. The sanctions will choke this off.
Well, sir, I hope you're right. And thank you so much. And it's great to have your thoughts and to hear you. That's Brigadier General Kevin Ryan, retired, and he is a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. Thank you, Kevin.
Yeah, good to see you again, Dana. Thank you.
Meantime, Russian President Putin is said to be in a nuclear bunker, possibly in the Russian Siberian Far East. That's weird. Is he scared of his own people or the West? But the idea he had to bury himself in a bunker is extreme. And Defense Minister Shoigu was also in a bunker, they say, in the Ural Mountains. If true, bizarre. Unless, of course, they were preparing to use a nuclear weapon and feared what storm of response that would bring. This is the Russian leadership we're seeing, going from paranoid to possibly unhinged, and that's scary. Let's pray for peace in Ukraine. The Russian military has failed on so many fronts there. The Kremlin needs to end this crisis it started. Thinking Ukrainians would open their arms to a Russian advance was just delusional. Thanks for listening to Backstory. Please share the podcast. I'm Dana Lewis, and I'll talk to you again soon.